Hi, welcome everyone to the Indian Debating League War and Peace Masterclass. The idea behind War and Peace Masterclass is to cover major conflicts around the world. As we see specifically post-COVID, three major conflicts have taken over the world and affecting both economy, international affairs, both national, international politics, and many aspects of our life. Today we're going to cover one of them, which is Middle East crisis with Hadar Goldberg. Hadar is obviously one of the best debaters that we know. Uh, just a quick introduction. Hadar is a WDC Best Speaker 2023, Open finalist, graduate of Tel Aviv University in Bachelor's of Law, currently working for Israeli Legal Office. And today we will be covering mainly three aspects of this sort of A, knowing about the current status quo, what this conflict is all about. B, there are multiple stakeholders, but obviously there are two primary stakeholders, which are Iran and Israel. What are their end goal? What are they trying to achieve? And where likely they stop? Or what is the tangible goal they are looking both of them? And third, for a country like India, where majority of us sort of come from, what is the way to look at it? And what are our sort of concern around this? How does it affect us? And all other parts. So these three things that we will be covering today. With that, over to Hadar.
Okay. As a general rule for peacekeeping, let's say that if anyone has questions throughout the workshop, they are encouraged. Just use the raise hand function on Zoom, and I will let you answer in specific intervals. And let's get started. I actually want to start with an anecdote, which wasn't originally my plan, but here it is. I am currently giving this workshop from my bomb shelter in my house in Tel Aviv. The reason I'm giving this workshop from my bomb shelter is because just yesterday night, my government striked an attack in Iran, and we expect a retaliation anytime soon. So I don't want to need to stop this workshop if missile alarms start, which might very well happen. Now, the reason I'm giving this anecdote, aside from it might be interesting, is I wanted to start with some caveat about what does it mean to teach you guys about the Middle East. The Middle East is a very, very complex region with a lot of history and a lot of context, and it is constantly developing. Just this morning, I had to make some last-minute updates to this workshop because of my government's attack in Iran. This means that inherently, this workshop is limited in its ability to cover everything. It is impossible to explain the entirety of the Middle East in an hour and a half. I had thoughts about giving some history overview in order to give context, and I realized very quickly it is impossible. Even if I were to just focus on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, it lasts for about a century now and has a lot of developments, not to mention other stakeholders involved in the conflict like Iran, Lebanon, Yemen, and so on. This is why, in order to have a framework for this workshop, I decided to start from the first major escalation point in the current conflict, which is October 7th, 2023. It does not mean that there is no context before. History started before October 7th, 2023, and I encourage all of you to read more about it, but it would be impossible for me to cover more than that in an hour and a half. With that caveat out of the way, let's start understanding what is actually going on. I want to start by understanding the timeline. On October 7th, 2023, Hamas, which is a terror organization in the Gaza Strip, launched an attack on Israel. If you're curious, this in the map over here is the Gaza Strip, this very small strand of land, and it has it went out to the surrounding area where it committed a bunch of violations of international laws, including rape, torture, and taking more than 200 hostages, which are still a big part of the current conflict. Several developments occurred almost immediately on the days to follow. All of the developments described in this screen happened in the very first month, in October 2023. One, Israel invaded the Gaza Strip. The Israel-Hamas war in Gaza has been ongoing ever since. You must have heard about it. This is when my own government also violated a bunch of international laws and evidently resulted in currently more than 40,000 people dead and mass starvation, people who are displaced from their homes, and so on. Secondly, Hezbollah started launching missile attacks on Israel's north. If you look at this map, we share a border with Lebanon on the north of the country. Hezbollah is not exactly Lebanon. We do not formally have war with Lebanon. I don't want to go into the full context of this because this could be a topic of its own lecture as well. But as a general understanding, Lebanon is extremely ethnically diverse. And when it was formed, there was an internal arrangement of a coalition of different ethnic groups trying to collaborate together. And each of them is meant to have some representation that is meaningful within the government. Hezbollah represent the Shia Muslims of Lebanon. They are not the Lebanese military. There is a Lebanese military as well. But despite the fact that the Lebanon government doesn't really approve of a lot of Hezbollah's actions, the political branch of the Shia Muslims in Lebanon prevents the Lebanese government from being able to fully stop them throughout. And this organization is heavily funded by Iran, who has a lot of proxies across the Middle East. So as a result of this, more than 100,000 Israelis have also been evacuated from their homes and are yet to have returned to their homes in the north due to constant missile attacks there. Thirdly, the US sent 2 aircraft carriers to Israel's northern border in an attempt to deter invasion from Hezbollah that would trigger an all-out war. We can debate how successful it was. It was very successful in the immediate target of preventing a Hamas-style invasion. In the beginning of the war, there were real concerns that Hezbollah would try something similar to what Hamas did, invade from the north, and start killing people, torturing people, taking hostages, and so on. This did not happen. However, the broader de-escalation plans worked for about a year until, as you'll see later in the timeline, my government did eventually invade Lebanon. Fourth thing that happened in the same month, the Houthis in Yemen started striking Israel's south. I'll show you in some later map, but as a general point for now, hold on, yes. So this over here is Yemen. This over here is Israel. That is a long distance. We don't historically have wars with Yemen because we don't share a border or any meaningful territorial disputes. But the Houthis are also an Iranian proxy, and in solidarity with the Hamas attack and with Palestinian cries, just like Hezbollah justified their own attacks, also started shooting towards Israel's south. The main involvement of the Houthis we'll get a bit more into later, but they did not manage to cause any meaningful harm within Israel, partially because of the distance. Rather, they managed to cause significant disputes in the Red Sea. The Red Sea is over here, like this is the Red Sea, and it is the entrance to the Suez Canal, which is where more than 10% of global trade goes through. So this caused a lot of trade barriers. And as a result of this, the US tried to fight the Houthis in the Red Sea. They have not been very successful in it. I see a question. Are there any questions or should I move on?
I will take the question at the end.
I can take one question now and then I'll move on. Yeah, let's take Elena.
Okay.
I cannot hear anything.
I also can't hear. RG and Hardik, do you have a question? Oh, okay. I got it. So I have to unmute them. Okay. Himanshu.
One question. So how much does the economy and trade get disrupted in this geopolitical war? I have one question.
I'll get to it more in the last slide because the third part of this workshop is going to be about the international effects of the war and particularly how it impacts India. But as a short intro to this, there are two main effects on the international economy. One is indeed the disruptions to the Suez Canal, despite the fact that the Houthis formally say that they don't want to target just any ship, but only Israeli ships. The fact is, if there are missile exchanges over the Red Sea, it effectively risks trade cargoes that go through the Suez Canal, which made a lot of them be slowed down, have to go through other routes, and so on. Secondly, especially since Iran joined around April, there have also been global rises in oil prices, but more on that later. Okay, let's continue. So for about half a year, this war continued without very major escalations beyond the Israeli-Gaza front, other than the fact that obviously in the north, Israelis could not go back to their homes. On April 1st, a turning point happened. Israel conducted an airstrike on the Iranian embassy in Damascus, Syria, that is over here. In this airstrike, they killed several members of the Revolutionary Guard, which is the organization effectively in power in Iran ever since the revolution. And most importantly, the attack killed General Reza Sahedi, a senior member and at the time commander of the Quds Force. The Quds Force is the general arm of Iran's proxies. This is how Iran maintains their relations and their control of their proxies, like Hezbollah, like the Houthis, and like the proxies they also have in Iraq and Syria. So killing their general was a big deal. This caused a very unprecedented event. On April 13th, Iran made a first-time direct attack on Israel. Now, let's be clear on what it means. Iran and Israel have been in unfriendly relations ever since the Iranian Revolution, and we have blamed them consistently for being behind a lot of the attacks on us from other organizations like Hezbollah. But there was never before a direct firing from within Iranian territory into Israeli territory. This is a new unexplored land, which is part of why the global world was shaken by it and is unsure what to expect. Because if most of the conflict so far was predictable, this is unpredictable, and it's hard to tell just how much it will escalate. In this attack, they used an estimate of 180 drones, 120 ballistic missiles, and 30 cruise missiles. This led to a coalition of Israel, the US, Jordan, and France, and the UK in intercepting the attack. Vast majority of the attack was intercepted. The IDF formal numbers say 99% of the entering or the weapons targeted at Israel were intercepted. Interestingly, this was not just collaboration in the classical sense. Because it was an unprecedented attack, it was also an unprecedented response. Usually, when we get aid from our allies, it is in the form of they send us money, they send us weapons, and then we do the fighting ourselves. In this case, the American, French, British, and Jordanian air forces themselves shot down Iranian drones and missiles targeted towards Israel. Part of why I'm saying this is to show to you why it is very important and why the war is very much impacted by the involvement of foreign actors. Here, again, if you look at the maps, just because of geography, almost every missile or drone going out from Iran to Israel has to effectively go through Jordan on our eastern border, which means that as long as we maintain our peace treaty with Jordan and they collaborate with us, we are able to effectively block a lot of those attacks. This is why, despite being on cold, friendly terms with our local allies like Egypt, Jordan, the UAE, and so on, Israel has very much an incentive in maintaining also its relations with other Arab nations and not just with the West. Following that, on April 19th, Israel retaliated, targeting air defense facilities within Iran. I want to stall a bit on this escalation and explaining the meaning of this a little. Neither Iran nor Israel want an all-out war between these two countries. I'll have a deeper dive into the incentives of both actors in the second part of this workshop. But both parties have a lot to lose. These are a few of the strongest militaries in the Middle East, if not in the world. And Israel doesn't want an additional front right now. Iran is facing economic struggles and internal instability and does not want to go to war. I think the interesting bit about this, and something to learn about how conflicts develop, is if you think about it, this whole conflict started with an invasion from a very small strand of land, so small that on this map you are no longer able to see it, the Gaza Strip within Israel. It very quickly escalated into much bigger countries getting involved because of the use of proxies, which is one of the main talking points against the use of proxies in modern days and how they lead to escalations and conflicts growing bigger. Iran did not want to attack Israel, but Hezbollah attacked Israel because Hamas attacked Israel and Israel retaliated, and Hezbollah is in solidarity with the Palestinians, and Iran cannot separate itself entirely from Hezbollah. So when a lot of the direct involvement of Iran with its proxies, particularly through the Quds Force, becomes a target for Israel, this is how wars escalate quite a bit. Questions now? Jasmine? Jasmine?
Ma'am, can you explain once more the second point?
Which second point?
Iran responded on April 13th.
Oh, on April 13th, Iran attacked Israeli territory for the first time. This was in response to the targeted assassination that killed General Zahedi. One last point I want to make about this attack, because it had some importance for the development of the rest of the warfare. This attack was sort of, with a caveat I'll get to later, a proof of the failure of drones in long-range attacks. And part of why you'll see in the next slide, in the second Iranian attack on Israel, they did not use drones, but focus more on ballistic missiles. The reason for this is to do with the difference between the technology of drones versus missiles. Missiles are shot through space, like to the space and down on the territory, and they go very fast. It takes a few minutes, I think roughly 10 minutes, for a missile from Iran to reach Tel Aviv. Drones are much more similar to tiny aircrafts that are unmanned. They don't get shot towards a country, they fly the entire aerospace towards a country. And obviously, in order to not be easily spotted or intercepted or cause any harm on the way, they also need to have a non-direct line and often travel across different regions to make convoluted journeys. This means for a drone to reach Israel from Iran, it takes more than 8 hours. This makes it much easier for our military and our allies to intercept it on time, and made Iran realize that drones are not that effective in the context of this war. This will not be as applicable to many other wars, such as in the Russia-Ukraine war, which drones have been very effective in, mostly because Russia and Ukraine share a direct border, and the long distance is not as much of a consideration. Okay, moving on in the timeline. On July 31st, Israel assassinated Ismail Haniyeh, who was the political leader of Hamas. Now, I'm not going to go over all targeted assassinations Israel did in this war because there were dozens, and we killed a lot of officials. Just a week ago or so, we killed their new political leader. But no not many assassinations were as significant as the assassination of Haniyeh. The main reason for this is not because of the character of Haniyeh himself, but because of the location. Ismail Haniyeh was not in Gaza. He was in Tehran, in Iran, when we managed to assassinate him and his bodyguard. This is also another step of escalation, because this meant we were able to infiltrate Iranian territory and kind of violate their sovereignty in order to conduct military operations there. If you want the analogy, I believe Canada is accusing India of doing something similar to terrorists within Canadian soil, which is leading to a lot of diplomatic disputes between you. Main difference is Canada is unlikely to shoot missiles at you, but that is because that is not the Middle East. So Iran really didn't like this, and already then promised there will be a response, and we will hear about it again. On the 17th and 18th of September, thousands of pagers and walkie-talkies exploded in Beirut, in Lebanon, in an Israeli attack. Technically, Israel never took responsibility for the pagers explosion. It is vastly, vastly believed that it was Israel behind this, possibly the Mossad. But without going too deeply into the technology behind this and how it happened, I want to also stop with why this was significant. The attack didn't kill many people, at least relative to other Israeli attacks. It killed 42 people. It injured more than 3,000 people, but this was not even the biggest effect of this attack. The biggest effect of this attack was the feeling of being penetratable and the feeling that every device you use might be booby-trapped. So, for example, as a result of this attack, both Hezbollah and Iran started giving their soldiers instructions to not use certain devices for fear they might be booby-trapped by Israeli military. This is also harming their ability to conduct other operations, because you need communication systems in order to have coordination within a relatively large military or militant group like Hezbollah. And this is partially why the attack didn't stop on the 17th, where we bombed a lot of pagers, but continued with bombing their walkie-talkies to show them any device can be booby-trapped. You don't know which will be the next one. Obviously, it also had effects on a lot of innocent Lebanese. While not many of them carry pagers or walkie-talkies, which are mostly military-use devices, a lot of them saw the attacks because these blew up in people's pockets, in the market, on the street, just in everyday situations. And a lot of people started fearing that their own devices might be booby-trapped as well. So Lebanon really didn't like this. This might also impact our chances of a future diplomatic relations with Lebanon. I'll get to that a bit later when I talk about interests of the parties. But it did cause a massive short-term harm to Hezbollah, which was very disoriented after this, as well as just had 3,000 of its high-ranking officials injured and unable to currently fight. Following this, and probably somewhat connected to this, on 27th September, Hassan Nasrallah, the leader of Hezbollah, was assassinated in an airstrike in Beirut. General Abbas Nilforoshan from the Revolutionary Guards was also killed in the attack. I don't think General Nilforoshan was as significant, but he was also mentioned by Iran as part of their justification for their retaliatory action. Hassan Nasrallah is very significant. Hassan Nasrallah has been the leader, both spiritual leader and military leader of Hezbollah for decades now. And unlike a lot of the targeted assassinations we made within Hamas ranks, which were immediately replaced, it is really not easy to replace Nasrallah. There are several reasons why it's not easy to replace Nasrallah. One is he is not just a military leader, he is also a significant religious figure and spiritual leader. People genuinely look up to him, not even only in Lebanon, but across the Shia world. This creates trust. This creates people who are willing to die for their causes. It is not that easy to find someone of his standing to replace him. Secondly, Nasrallah was very, very fearful of being replaced from within. While we know for sure that a lot of the recent leaders in Hamas that we killed have told their people in advance to prepare for their death and tried to already create replacements, Nasrallah really didn't plan to die. And he really didn't want to be overtaken from within, which is why he didn't quite develop any potential heir who could replace him as easily and have all of the experience and all of the relevant knowledge. So after this, Hezbollah was left very disoriented and disorganized and were very slow to respond to this attack as well. The other reason this assassination is significant is because we used American weapons in this attack. It was impossible to do it otherwise. Nasrallah was deep in bunkers, which means we needed heavy missiles that carry anti-cement chemicals, which is some advanced missiles we got from the US have it, that were able to penetrate through the cement of the bunker. And allegedly, we did it without direct coordination with the US. Like when Biden was asked about this immediately after it happened, he said, I don't know about this. It was not coordinated with us in advance. I need to read up about this and understand it better before I can comment. So this also marked some form of unstable relations between us and the US of using their weapons without direct coordination with them. This is something that Iran also had to respond to. For reasons I'll elaborate more later in this workshop, Iran cannot just abandon one of its main proxies, its ally, without any response when they take such significant hits from a rival. In fact, the Houthis directly criticized them for it and called them cowards who only use their proxies but never intervene when they are needed. So Iran was very much provoked to act. This is why, on October 1st, Iran launched 200 ballistic missiles, or nearly 200. It might have been like 180, but these are the scales, at Israeli targets. They claimed the assassination of Haniya in their territory, Nasrallah, and Nilfurushan as their casus belli, their cause of war, their justification to attack. This time, only half of these missiles were intercepted. Because these are long-range missiles that reach our territory fast, we could not intercept all of them before they even reach our airspace, and it forced us to prioritize. So citizens were warned in advance to be in their bunkers and not count on our Iron Dome and other intercepting systems because it was clear we will not be able to intercept all of them. They even managed to cause some harm. It is disputed how much harm they did cause. We know for sure that some of their missiles hit an Air Force base in the south of Israel called Nevatim. This is important because our Air Force is also one of our main advantages in most conflicts in the Middle East. We have a superior Air Force to most powers here, particularly relative to Iran, and we could not afford it getting hit. Israel claims it was minor harm caused to it. Iran claims bigger harms. We don't know for sure. A lot of it is classified. So this was yet another escalation. Most interestingly, and one of the recent changes I had to make to this workshop, on the same day, Iran posed a direct and clear threat. It expected an Israeli retaliation, just like they had after the earlier attack. This time they said, if there will be any Israeli retaliation, we will strike back even more fiercely. If Israel doesn't attack us back, we are willing to stop it as it is and say that we got ours out of it. And for a long time, there were a lot of talks on what Israel will do. Now we did. So I'll give you a brief overview of what was the dilemma even, and what are the possibilities still on the table, and what might we look forward to next. So there is the binary question, which was never too much in dispute, of should Israel respond or not. On the one hand, Iran gives a credible threat. If we don't respond, they'll stay out of it. If we respond, they attack again. So a choice from us to retaliate is an effective means of escalation in the war. On the other hand, letting this attack go unanswered is also very bad for deterrence in the long run. This has been a very unprecedented attack that did manage to cause some harm to us. And we do have concerns that if we do nothing, it sends a signal not only to Iran, but also to other parties in the Middle East that they can get away with it. So in all truthness, it was very obvious that Israel will attack. And in fact, we have been saying we will do this for a while. There have even been leaks from the Pentagon of direct talks that the Israeli War Cabinet had with the American government of specific plans of the attack, which is why it is believed that we were meant to attack earlier than today and have postponed this because our initial plan was kind of revealed and leaked. However, within the possible spectrum of responses, we chose one of the most moderate ones possible. There were largely 4 possible answers that or targets we could choose. At the highest end of the escalations, we could target their nuclear facilities, interfering with their nuclear plan. This would have been a very major escalation in the war if we were to choose to do so. We were warned by the US to not go that far. Second option, which is also would have been quite extreme, would be to target direct symbolic personnel within the leadership. So, try and get Khamenei this time or someone closer to the plate. This would also cause a lot of escalation. We've seen what our previous assassinations did, and to be honest, is dubious whether it would have significant benefits for us, because not all targeted assassinations are useful. As I've told you earlier, each assassination has its own characteristics. Some leaders are easy to replace, some are difficult to replace, some have unique expertise, some do not, and so on. We do not think that there would be a very significant advantage to us from replacing the current Ayatollah Khamenei with someone else. The real discussion was between 2 main options, which were more moderate. The one we opted for is attacking direct military infrastructure. So bases where they have weapons, where they have tanks, where they have their aircrafts, and so on. The ones we attacked allegedly had weapon systems that they imported from Russia. So this might even have some indirect effects on the Russia-Ukraine war if currently, as a result, Iran needs to get more weapons from Russia. The other option, which has more interesting reasons for why it was rejected, was targeting their energy facilities. So mainly their oil reserves and their oil pumps. This would actually be very effective, according to a lot of generals in the Israeli Defense Forces, because one of Iran's major weaknesses in this war is budgetary. Their military budget is smaller than Israel, despite being a larger country. They are very poor under international sanctions, and they don't get aid from any main ally like Israel gets from the US. If we're able to hurt one of their main sources of income, that is their oil, this would have been a very big practical harm on their ability to conduct future attacks, as well as deterring effect. However, it is believed that the reason this didn't happen is the US. And this kind of ties to the question someone asked earlier about the international effects of the war. If we were to target oil facilities in Iran, the immediate response to this would be in the market. Oil prices would rise significantly. And this would be particularly bad in time of American elections, which is why it is believed that Biden pressured us not to do it in order to not harm the Democrats' chance of winning the US elections. Questions now, Pratik?
Okay, I think many of them are waiting to be. Just a second. Let me first. Hadar. Mohammed Zuar asked one mute. Okay, Mohammed, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, sir. So, sir and ma'am, my question was that if Israel is attacking on Iran, and if they are planning to attack on their oil products and factories, then will this have a direct impact on India or will it have an impact globally?
So I'll get to this more in the third part of the workshop, but it will have direct impacts, definitely globally and probably also on India. The short answer to this is, technically speaking, India doesn't directly import oil from Iran. If you Google Indian imports from Iran, you will not find much. However, less technically, India does import oil through Iraq. And Iraq gets a lot of its oil from Iran. This is a coveted way through which India is able to get Iranian oil without violating the global sanctions on Iran. And as you may already know, India is a very, very oil-dependent country. It is not self-sufficient in its oil needs and heavily reliant on imports. So this would have significant effects on the cost of import in India. Okay.
Himanshu VM.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you so much for this chance. When you spoke about the assassinations of prominent Hezbollah and Hamas leaders, what about the death of Yahya Sinwar? Doesn't it create a new dimension for the war? Because he is a very influential personality.
Real answer, I don't think so. I don't want, I was thinking about this. I don't want to get too deep into targeted assassinations and when they are meaningful and when they are not meaningful. I recommend, if any of you is interested, at least in the debatory sense, I believe it was the 2018, maybe 2017 round robin final, one of these years, that was this house believes that countries should abandon the strategy of decapitations, which was a debate particularly about the question of, are decapitations effective or not? And a lot of the debate talked about more effective and less effective examples. The real answer about Yahya Sinwar is, I don't personally think it's meaningful. I do not have access to all the information. Maybe I'm wrong, but honestly, he has been in power for a very short period of time. He's replaced Ismail Haniyeh in August after we assassinated him. So he only has a few months in power. He was a replacement. He has an immediate replacement. And more importantly, I think, Hamas as an organization is already massively scattered. There's a reason why I'm not talking about Hamas too much in these slides. I genuinely think that most of the capacity of Hamas as an organization has already been, at least in the short term, eliminated in this war. It is not to say that they might not become powerful again in a few years of recovering, but we have destroyed majority of their arsenal. We have killed at least a third of their people, is according to our estimates, and we have ruined a lot of their tunnels underneath Gaza. So already now they are acting a bit disaggregated. We also see it in the change to the way that they make their warfares. They are not so coordinated. They really operate at this point as like a few terrorists here, a few terrorists there, and it doesn't seem like their leadership is that meaningful anymore. So I think killing Ismail Haniyeh was meaningful. I don't think there is additional meaningful change to also killing Sinwar. I'll take one more question and then we'll move on.
Yes.
Okay.
Sorry.
Just for the reference, I've shared the link to the motion Hadar is referring. We will take one more questions and then we'll move on. So
Thank you, ma'am.
Prateek Raj, I believe 8-3 Yeah, go ahead. Last question.
Question is that if the Iranian ruler Khamenei is assassinated, what are the consequences?
If the Iranian regime does what?
Ma'am, if Khamenei dies due to assassination.
If Khamenei dies. Look, if Khamenei dies, They will replace him. They have replacements. They are a very hierarchical organization, so they will not struggle too much to find a replacement. They will be very mad, and they will definitely attack us more severely this time. I'll get to that also a bit later. I think actually the next slide is about the capacity of the actors. Yes. So I think this might answer partially the question. What can Iran actually do to Israel? What can Israel actually do to Iran? What are actually the military strengths of both parties? Because so far, I genuinely think both sides made mostly symbolic attacks. We could have done much more harm to them, and we chose not to de-escalate. They could have done much more harm to us, and they chose not to de-escalate. In fact, there have been a lot of jokes about this, that Iran warned us for so much time in advance about this war, about this attack and the nature of the attack and how it would look like. It almost seemed like they're trying to prepare us to help us prevent it from being too deadly. Kind of trying to hit both worlds, trying to seem strong to their own followers and not seem like they are standing aside when their proxies are being hurt, but not going into an all-out war. This is the gentle balance that I think both Israel and Iran are trying to tread. But definitely there is capacity to do much more if this war escalates. So let's talk capacity for a second. Iran is believed to have more than 3,000 ballistic missiles. That is at least how much we believe that they had at 2021, if I remember correctly. They've probably developed some more since. They are manufacturing their own missiles as well as import some from Russia. But probably we're looking at like 3,000 to 3,500 ballistic missiles. We don't know how many of these can cross the distance between Iran and Israel. There's more than 1,000 kilometers distance. Not all ballistic missiles are that long range, but we know many of them can cross this distance. Israel, in contrast, is believed to have a much smaller arsenal, albeit most of which is more technologically advanced, which makes it primarily more targeted. We are more able to hit the targets we are looking at when Iran is more trying to shoot darts in the dark. However, there are a lot of caveats to this that make the Iranian potential threat on Israel more than just 3,000 ballistic missiles, because the optimistic in me wanted to think on the day that they shot nearly 200 missiles at us, well, look, if they only have 3,000 and they shot 200 at us and it barely hit anyone, then even if they do it every single day, in a couple of weeks, they will run out of their arsenal. Not that simple. There are a few reasons for concern to believe that Iran is capable of doing much more than that. One, Iran has missiles it did not use yet. If you want, you can search there. There's a lot of intelligence that's already leaked on the missiles in Iranian possession. Some of them they even take pride in and say and publish themselves. And some of them were not used for sure in the recent attacks. Particularly, they do have a smaller arsenal of more targeted missiles that could potentially hit more direct targets as opposed to hit the sea or other uninhabited territories. Secondly, the amount of explosives you load on a missile is also something you can change. We don't know exactly how many explosives they loaded on the missile heads. Even if they send the exact same missiles that they did in the last time, they could load them potentially with more explosives that could cause more harm. Thirdly, proxies. One of the reasons proxies are important to Iran is because they help bridge through the geographic distance. So as we said, the main reasons drone failed the last time is because it took them 8 hours to reach from Iran to Israel. Here's another anecdote. Just very recently, a drone attack by an Iranian missile was one of the deadlier attacks we had in Israel, killing 4 people and injuring more than 40 in a military basis. This was not shot by Iran. It was an Iranian drone shot by Hezbollah. Hezbollah is right on our borders. It doesn't take drones that Hezbollah shoots at us reach as long as 8 hours. So Iran could also supply Hezbollah with much more weapons that would bridge the geographic barrier for them. And the last thing to keep in mind is Iranian allies, in particular, Russia. Iran and Russia have been exchanging weapons and engaging in weapons trade for many, many years. And they make up for each other where the other is lacking. As I said earlier, drones were not that effective in the Iran-Israeli war because of the distance, but they were very effective in Ukraine. This means Russia, which is a huge manufacturer of ballistic missiles, has an incentive and does export ballistic missiles to Iran and imports drones from it. And we don't know how much more Russian involvement could expand in the war, leading to Iran being even stronger. In terms of the capacity of other stakeholders, Israel, as I said, has a relatively small arsenal. What we do have is one of the strongest air forces in the region. And most or I don't know if most, but a lot of our missile strikes were actually by aircrafts that carried missiles to another territory and then dropped them there, as opposed to missile crossing through all of this distance. So this is something that Iran wants to take into consideration. The second thing Israel has is very advanced intelligence. And we have managed to infiltrate territories, including Iranian territory, many times during the war, which is why Iran is also concerned about the pagers explosion in Lebanon and also instructed the Revolutionary Guards to replace their devices. Because even if Israel doesn't want to start an all-out war from the air, it could infiltrate inside Iran and cause harm there, direct assassinations, and so on. Thirdly, Israel has the US as its strongest ally. The US is a very big dog in every neighborhood. The US has the biggest and strongest military in the world. And during this war, they have provided us with a lot of unprecedented aid. Almost $18 billion, last I checked, only this year, from the US to the IDF. This is while Iran is starved for money because of global sanctions and is not able to fund a lot of its military. So this is in terms of Israel's capacity. One last thing I'll mention about Israel's capacity, which I don't think should be very relevant in this war, and I pray will not become relevant in the near future, but should be known. Israel has nukes. Iran is developing nuclear arms, which is a reason for concern. Israel already has them. We technically don't formally admit it, but there's been both external and internal investigations that have already unraveled this. If things escalate way too much, it could end up really, really bad. I want to think that our government is still sufficiently rational to not go that way. There are many, many barriers that would stop it before it happens. But it is a point of deterrence against Iran as well. In terms of Hezbollah, I will mention that Hezbollah has originally had a lot of weapons arsenal. By our estimates, when the war started, they had 15,000 missiles. Most of them are not intelligent missiles, not targeted or long-ranged, but are very effective in bombing the north. So even if they couldn't cross the distance to Tel Aviv, they were still very effective in holding more than 100,000 of our citizens evacuated from their homes for over a year, unable to go back, which obviously also causes a lot of economic harm when this area cannot go back to normalcy. So Iran also operates through Hezbollah. We don't know for sure how strong Hezbollah is now after the invasion. We know that we caused them significant harm. Per the IDF, we have already destroyed about 50% of their arsenal, in addition to them being disoriented because of the death of Nasrallah, because of the pagers explosion, and so on. This is in terms of capacity of how much things can escalate in the region. Questions now. Jihansh?
Yes, Jen.
Yeah, so I wanted to ask that aren't as you said that US is supplying and Israel. So US is supplying Israel, and Russia is actually supplying Iran. So aren't US and Russia just using Israel and Iran as outputs for their own rivalry? Like it can.
So that's a question more of an opinion. I don't think there's a factual answer to this. I have heard a lot of people refer to Israel as an American proxy, similar to how Hezbollah is an Iranian proxy, which I don't think is that absurd to say. However, I don't think this is the right way to look at it for several reasons. One, Iran is definitely not a Russian proxy. Iran is allied with Russia, but they're not fully dependent on Russia. They manufacture their own weapons extensively, and they are a major superpower in the region. In terms of Israel and the US, it's a bit more complicated. We are kind of fully reliant on them. We take a lot of pride in our intelligence and in our technology, which is fair. We have developed a lot of things independently and now export weapons to the whole world. At the same time, in terms of budgets, in terms of collaboration with other US allies in the region, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and so on, that gives us more intelligence access points and allow us to make major coalitions like we did to intercept the Iranian attack. And in terms of some of the weapons that America uniquely provides, one of the most important of them, by the way, which is seldom talked about, is the interceptions. Our interception systems are Americans mostly and are very expensive, and we are running out of intercepting missiles. And if we run out of them, it means every attack here is actually going to hit the ground and kill us. So we very much need the US. And this gives them a lot of control over what we do and why we do abide with a lot of their requests. Recently, as I said earlier, there have been several instances where Israel didn't obey the US or didn't fully collaborate and coordinate with them, which brings questions on how much this alliance will stay in the long run. But I don't think, the short answer is I don't think we are American proxies. We are definitely very impacted by the US. Okay, I want to continue and I'll take more questions later. Okay, interests. Let's start with Iran. What does Iran want? And I'm being a bit simplistic here because Iran isn't this mythical entity. Iran is a huge country with a lot of people and with its own internal complicated systems. I want to give a very, very quick overview of what happened in Iran after the Iranian Revolution. There is a government in Iran. There is a president of Iran who is quite moderate and somewhat liberal, and as of recently at least, and there is an Iranian military. There is also the Revolutionary Guards, ruled by the Ayatollah Khamenei. Effectively, the Revolutionary Guards are the most powerful in the region. They have the stronger military that handles most of the external invasions and most of the external warfare. And they are also the religious leaders. So one example of this dependency is, in order to even run for presidency in Iran, you need to be approved by a committee of the Ayatollahs to allow you to run for office, which is why only Shia Muslims ever are allowed to run, and you will never see any religious minority running for president. So the interests of Iran are a weird mixed bag of the interests of the Revolutionary Guard and the interest of the president, which don't always align. Proxies. Proxies are a primary interest of the Revolutionary Guard. Iran has proxies across the Middle East. Why are they important? Several reasons. One of them I already discussed, which is it allows them to bridge geographic barriers, not just with Israel, with Saudi Arabia, with any meaningful rival they have in the region. They want to have a proxy nearby so that if a war ever breaks or escalation breaks, they can attack more directly without going through all of the distance that is a major barrier for warfare. Another reason why the proxies are important to them is because it allows them to maintain their hands clean. The reason why Iran never directly attacked Israel before this year is because it didn't want Israeli retaliation against Iran. And using Hezbollah allowed it to be effectively attacking Israel, but without giving Israel a casus belli, a cause for war, in Iran. So they really prefer using proxies when they can. The additional reason is also just ideological. Like the Revolutionary Guard claims to be the leader of the Shia world. And this is why they want to support all Shia organizations and all Shia revolutions wherever they are. Now, the reason this interest is important is because it means they need to support their proxies. And they have a lot of control over their proxies, but not full control. It is believed that they actually tried to de-escalate in a much earlier phase, and they didn't want Hezbollah to attack as much as they did here because they wanted to avoid an all-out war between Hezbollah and Israel that would involve Iran. But what happened, happened. And this means that they cannot just let Nasrallah die without a response. Part of this is not just because they want Hezbollah to stay strong, but because it's also a signaling effect to every other proxy. As I said, the Houthis criticized them. They said, how can we trust that you'll ever stand up to us if you didn't stand up to Hezbollah? So in order to maintain their strength and their control over all of their proxies, they have to go in their defense in this conflict. Secondly, they want to protect their leaders. They don't like targeted assassinations. It interferes with their ability, with their safety. It interferes with their sense of control. Thirdly, domestic stability. This is kind of in tension with a lot of the other goals. The Revolutionary Guard is not an elected body. And we don't know for sure because polls are not a very good indicator in a dictatorship, but the Iranian public doesn't like the Revolutionary Guard, at least a lot of them don't. And this is a country that has already been through 2 revolutions in the 20th century and has major protests all over the streets every 2 years. So they do have incentives of maintaining some internal stability. Why does this matter in the context of this conflict? I don't think the average Iranian cares so much about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. I don't think they hate us. I don't think they love us. I don't think they care. I think they care when Israel attacks in Iran, putting their lives at risk, putting their economy at risk, and so on. This is part of why we believe the president, which represents the people, wants de-escalation and has made some efforts towards diplomacy before. For example, tried to talk back about the Iranian nuclear deal with the US, which is probably not going to happen now after the recent escalations. But this is why the president or the government that is elected might pressure for more de-escalation. Fourth interest, the Revolutionary Guard also cares about growing or at least not shrinking the economy. Iran is very poor. Iran has faced massive sanctions as a result of its nuclear plan, mainly from the US, but also from other countries across the globe. This means that they don't have a lot of money. And aside from impacting stability, because people don't like being poor, it also impacts their military ambitions. You can't fund the military with nothing. And part of the risks of instability and escalation could also be harms to the economy. Fifth interest on the agenda is the nuclear plan. Iran wants to be a nuclear superpower. They've been developing their nuclear plans for a long time now, and they've declared many times they want to have nukes. There are many reasons for this. I think they're mostly self-explanatory. Some of their enemies have nukes. They want to have mutually assured destruction as a means of deterrence. And they want to also have this last card in the pack in order to be able to threaten with, in order to gain more power and leverage in smaller scale conflicts as well. Lastly, freedom of action in the Middle East. Iran has many other interests aside from in this small region of Israel. In fact, I would say that otherwise they would probably care more about the internal conflict in Yemen than they would about Israel if things wouldn't develop the way they developed this year. In Yemen, for context, you can look a map for it. There is a massive proxy war between the Iranian proxies and the Saudi Arabian proxies, which causes a massive humanitarian crisis and so on. And about like the western half of Yemen is controlled by the Houthis from Iran, and the eastern half of Yemen is controlled by Saudi Arabia. And this is where their bigger front is at. Now, part of their interest in this war is also Israel is somewhat of a disturbance to their freedom of action more generally. Because Israel sees Iran as a threat, Israel tries to harm its capacity in more than just the context of Hezbollah, although primarily in Hezbollah. But this is why we have, for years, attacked Quds forces in Syria and Iraq as well. This is why we have tried to prevent the Iranian nuclear deal at the time, because we wanted the sanctions regime to sustain and so on. So they don't really like us, is the short explanation. And one of their interests in harming us is also to guarantee their own freedom of action uninterrupted. Interests of Israel. I'll separate this a bit from what the interests should be in a good world where I could trust my government fully and be completely non-cynical, and political interests. So here are the real interests of Israel, if we're looking like the Israeli people and what is in our benefit. In the short term, the most obvious interests are two. We want the safe return of the hostages. There are a little over 100 of them left in Gaza, over a year in captivity. Their families want to have them home. There have been massive protests of over 500,000 people on the streets, which is like, maybe sounds like a tiny population in India, but is like 5% of our entire population, to pressure the government to get them back. So this is one direct incentive. There are many ways to get the hostages back. The safest one is through a prisoner exchange deal. So this would be some ceasefire treaty in which we give Hamas prisoners, they give us our hostages, and we agree to some form of ceasefire. I could go on that forever, but the short version is there is, for more than a year of negotiations, failure to find a terms of agreement that both sides are willing to accept. The second short-term obvious interest is returning the displaced populations to their homes. As I said, there are over 100,000 Israelis that currently cannot access their homes up north. We want the shooting that has been ongoing for over a year to stop so that we can return them. Long-term is the trickier question. So obviously we want long-term security and stability. The internal divide and political discussion here always is on how do you reach security and stability. So there are like three common perceptions on this. One, ruining enemy capacity. As a general observation, one of the reasons we attacked in Lebanon is honestly because we had an excuse. We were fearing Hezbollah for a long time before this war. They've been strengthening and strengthening, and we were worried that in not many more years, the gaps between us technologically and in terms of ammunition and so on will reduce dramatically. And this war gave us a casus belli to attack. So a cynical approach would say that part of the reason to attack was not only a direct self-defense for the people that have been displaced, but also an excuse to ruin infrastructure for Hezbollah. And the criticism of this approach is obviously, but what if they rebuild their infrastructure? What if Iran just sends them more missiles? Now, for some of the infrastructure, it's easier. For some of them, it's less easy. For example, ruining tunnels is much harder to resuscitate from as a terror organization. You don't just import more tunnels. It takes a long time to rebuild tunnels. But ammunition is very easy to refill. Second approach for achieving stability and security is deterrence. Now, this is very disputed. On the one hand, deterrence might create an incentive for countries not to attack us. On the other hand, as you've seen, deterrence can also lead to escalations. We attack to deter, they attack to retaliate. We attack to retaliate, and it never ends. A third approach is a diplomatic approach, which says we need a partner. We need to actually get something resembling sustainable peace here. And this could, of course, also be a topic for a full lecture of its own. I will suffice by saying now that this dream is more realistic on some fronts than others. For example, if we don't ruin our relations with the Lebanese government too much, there is a potential realistic chance of more meaningful peace with Lebanon, because the Lebanese government is not our enemy. Hezbollah is our enemy. The Lebanese government wants to get rid of Hezbollah, but they currently lack capacity to do this. There is a dream where after this war, we could maintain some peace with them, and with the aid of the UN, the US, and other organizations, maintain a sustainable, actually powerful government that is able to limit Hezbollah significantly. And then we could have relative peace with them. On other fronts, it's much harder. Like getting sustainable peace in Gaza is seeming like an unattainable dream to most people who live here. Hamas is definitely not trying to ever reach peace with us. They are a terror organization that have on their forefront the agenda of killing us all. As for the people of Gaza, this is a bit more complicated. A lot of them don't like Hamas for very obvious reasons. They also really don't like us for even more obvious reasons. And to be quite honest, most Israelis don't really like them. This is kind of the outcome of a 100 years conflict. But the context in Gaza is also the massive internal instability that leads to lack of legitimate government that could be formed. So Gaza, for context, has been a refugee camp in Egypt before we occupied it. It wasn't like an independent state or something like this. And they don't have a history of democracy or even a history of governance. Hamas is the first effective government they have. And even if we destroy Hamas, the outcome will be a power vacuum, which will probably result in one of the other 5 or 6 terror organizations operating in Gaza taking their place. There have been talks about making, at least in the short term, some international coalition of powers like the US, the UAE, the PLO, and so on in Gaza that will make some external control, kind of similar to what the US did in Japan or in Eastern Germany after the Second World War. We don't know how much it would work. But we have never had anything resembling peaceful relations with any stakeholder in Gaza. So this is the main criticism against the diplomatic approach, that it won't work. Thirdly, Israel wants to maintain its diplomatic relations, a major one being the US. I think I've already explained throughout this workshop many times why the US is very vital to us and we cannot survive without them. We also care about our diplomatic relations with other powers. As I said earlier, Jordan was very meaningful in our ability to block Iranian attacks earlier this year. So we do want to maintain and strengthen our relations in this area as well. In fact, one of the speculated triggers for the Hamas attack on October 7th, 2023, is that Saudi Arabia was talking normalization of relations with Israel and was probably soon to acknowledge Israel's statehood and form some trade deals with us, similar to the Abraham Accords that we had with the UAE. And Hamas wanted to stop this, and they were very effective. Saudi Arabia cannot politically afford to normalize relations with Israel right now, given the reputation Israel has gave itself everywhere, but mostly in the Muslim world. So we also have an incentive that is not well served by this war to maintain our relations with other allies. Fourthly, not being sanctioned by the International Court. This extends to both the ICJ and the ICC. So I imagine most of you already know this, but for those who don't, there are several standing trials. One of them is against the government of Israel for genocide in the ICJ, the International Court of Justice. Others are against specific personnel, including Netanyahu, including our military general and the Minister of Defense, for violating international laws in the ICC, the International Criminal Court. I actually think the ICC trials are more meaningful, albeit they are slightly less covered because genocide is a very big word that catches a lot of eyes. I don't want to get too deeply into this. That is a rabbit hole and we will never get out of it. I encourage you to read all of the released protocols from the ICJ discussions, but I'll suffice by saying I don't think it is extremely likely that the ICJ will determine there is genocide in Gaza. This is not a statement on what I believe. It is not a statement on whether there is or isn't genocide in Gaza. Only that the burden of proof to prove the threshold for genocide in international law is extremely high. There have only been 3 cases across history where this has been acknowledged. To give you some examples, China has not been charged with genocide. Pakistan has not been charged with genocide. Like, there have been many well-known genocides in history that have never been formally acknowledged by the ICJ. This is less likely, at least for now, to be a concern. The ICC trials are a bit more of a concern for our leaders because these might actually prove their case. They have a lower threshold. They stand for weaker violations, and they also have a very easy means of enforcement. It is not fully clear what sanctions to enforce against a full country, especially with the US on our side. But the EU, at least, is very likely to collaborate with the ICC decisions. And if the ICC decides that Benjamin Netanyahu is an international war criminal, it means every time Netanyahu lands in Europe, whether it is for diplomacy or in a emergency landing on his way to the US, he will need to be arrested. That is a big interest that he probably wants to avoid. So we are also looking into the developments of the discussions in the International Court that somewhat guide our decisions here as well. Lastly, the government also has political interests like any government. So this, I'll give the short version because there's a lot to say here. Netanyahu has been a prime minister consecutively, almost with 1.5 year gap since 2009. He's a populistic leader that maintains his rule for a long time. And he is very, very much not wanting re-elections, at least yet. It might change soon. The reason he doesn't want re-elections are the following. One, he very well might lose this time. He lost a lot of popularity after the October 7th attacks. It was seen as a failure of the government, and this meant that he might lose the next elections. Crucially, if he loses the elections, he might go to jail. Because aside from the ICC trials, there are plenty of domestic trials against Netanyahu for corruption. And he cannot be trialed while he is prime minister. He can be trialed when he is not. And this is a very big incentive for him to maintain his government intact. It might change soon because his popularity in polls is on the rise again. Recent achievements, especially in Lebanon, increased his popularity, like the killing of Nasrallah, boosted his popularity in polls. And this might mean he might decide that soon is a good time to have elections. But the importance of this is, as long as he doesn't want re-elections, then he will not want the war in Gaza at least to end. Maybe in the north is fine. There are two reasons for this. One, the war in Gaza gives him an excuse to not run re-elections, because you can't run an elections when you have ongoing war and you need political stability and someone to run the business. Secondly, because a big part of his coalition is right-wing messianic extremists, and this is primarily Ben Gvir's party, smaller also Smotrich's party. You can search both of these names. I don't need to say much more than Ben Gvir has been convicted 8 times for terrorism by our police, yes, not by international police. And he's a minister in the current government. That is far from an ideal situation to be in. But Ben Gvir is very militant. And he threatened several times that if Netanyahu accepts any form of ceasefire, he will leave the government. And if he does leave the government in its current structure, it would leave Netanyahu without the 51% of the seats he needs to maintain his governance and will immediately enact re-elections. So despite having not a huge party, Ben Gvir has a lot of power in this government and also is responsible for a lot of the escalations. Questions quickly? Himanshu?
Hello. Thank you, ma'am. So when you're talking about relations and allies with other countries, recently there's been a little bit of cold relationship with France because Emmanuel Macron didn't like Israel invading into Lebanon, and there's been a verbal argument, and then the French government has also told that they're not going to supply arms or something like that. So do you think it's going to impact the war as such, or is US's support still strong enough to compensate for the France?
It impacts somewhat, not a lot. I will say that we are not as concerned about our relations with France as we are with the US. One, because it is perceived as a short-term harm. Macron is not very popular in France right now. He might be replaced in 2027, and whereas in the US there is a trend of the relations getting weaker. Secondly, just because we are much less reliant on them. They did give us weapons, but significantly less than the US. So we don't like it. It is a talking point here, but it is not likely to make a major shift in the war. Okay. I'll get to the last part because we have 10 minutes left, and then hopefully there will be 5 minutes left for questions. So the last part is global effects of the conflict with an emphasis of India. So I'll brush through quickly the global effects and then I'll do a slightly deeper dive to India. One, as I said earlier, oil prices rise, mostly because Iran is a major exporter of oil. Two, more than 10% of global trade has been halted or slowed down by the strikes over the Red Sea because the Suez Canal is extremely significant. Thirdly, there is rise in terror attacks across the world. These are mostly terror attacks targeting Israelis and Israeli embassies. Most of them have been in Europe so far, although recently there was also one in Sri Lanka. I don't know if it makes it likelier that it will happen in India as well. It's just a new territory to look into. There has also been global rise in both Islamophobia and anti-Semitism as a result of the conflict. People wrongly associate all Muslims as sharing the blame for Hamas and wrongly ascribe all Jews as sharing the blame for the actions of the Israeli government. And this caused a rise in both Islamophobic and anti-Semitic attacks across the world. And lastly, in terms of global effects, other US allies, as well as Iranian proxies, look at the war to learn what they can expect from their partners. So I already mentioned the Iranian proxies front and how the Houthis are looking at what Iran doing to decide if it is a reliable ally. It's worth pointing that other countries are looking at the US as well. There are many interests the US has in Israel. I will not go to all of them right now, but one of them is also that allies like Ukraine or Taiwan are also looking into what the US does here to see how much they can rely on them to continue supporting them if their own wars escalate farther and so on. In terms of India, let's do a slightly deeper dive. By far, the biggest impact on India is going to be in terms of oil. More than 80% of India's oil is imported. It is not self-sufficient for its energy needs. India doesn't directly import oil from Iran. However, as I said earlier, it does indirectly import it through Iraq. However, India also imports a lot of its oil from the UAE and Saudi Arabia, which are both major Iranian rivals and would not appreciate India normalizing the relations with Iran too much. India did actually have plans to import oil directly from Iran this year. There were talks earlier this year about a trade agreement happening on these lines. This was put to an end when the escalations happened, realizing that Iran is not a very safe partner to rely on right now. Small notes on oil prices. One, it is worth noting that oil prices rise even before a major hit on any energy facility due to instability. The reason for this is just the nature of markets. When the stock market is kind of buying and selling oil, partially for investment, gambling on will oil prices increase or decrease in the future, people look at the conflict and even before any significant disturbance to oil provision happened, expect one to happen and already price it in the current price of oil. So there's already been some rises. Second piece of context that is important here, Iranian oil is cheap. Because of the sanctions and the fact that most of the world doesn't buy from it, Iran sells its oil for cut price, kind of similar to what Russia does and why India buys a lot of oil from Russia now. So that is in terms of oil. Secondly, Suez Canal. I already mentioned the importance of this for the global trade. It's even more important for India. More than 35% of India's total foreign trade, and specifically 65% of its crude oil imports, go through the Suez Canal. The reason for this can be seen very easily in this map. India's ports are mostly trading, at least with the West, through the Indian Ocean. Now, there are two ways to reach from the Indian Ocean to the West. One of them was through the Red Sea, through the Suez Canal over here to Europe. The other is through the Cape of Good Hope across all of Africa. As you can tell, there is a big difference in the distance and in the amount of time it takes to cross this distance, which means India has been affected a lot by its trade, given that it needs to now go through longer journeys for its both imports and exports. In terms of its relations with Israel, I don't expect much of it would change, but for context, India imports arms and ammunition, as well as aircraft and spacecraft equipment from Israel, alongside various other technologies. Your governments and mine also have a lot of collaborations on research projects and education, and you also have some trade collaborations with us. So in recent years, we have an Indian port in Haifa, which is on the north of Israel, and actually impacted quite a bit by the strikes from Hezbollah. And There is a question here, I think, mostly of how will India change its foreign relations as a result. My expectation is that India will not change much. Historically, India's approach to its foreign relations was to be kind of a bystander. We don't take any sides. We don't care west, east. We want to help our people not starve, and we will do whatever is best for us economically. I expect this is what India will continue doing. I think it is not likely that it will therefore take part in any boycotts or sanctions on Israel, even if more Western governments start doing so, because it's not in its direct incentive. It would also not want to take any stance that would potentially alienate the UAE or Saudi Arabia. I also don't think the other direction will happen. It's unlikely that India would start sanctioning Iran more or intervening in a more direct manner. However, it is worth noting that it is currently in some trade relations with both partners and has potential implications on its trade as a result. Smaller points, a lot of Indian diaspora lives in Gulf countries who are more influenced by Iran. I don't think it is a huge impact on Indian government, but it is sometimes requiring the diplomatic involvement of Indian government. So as an anecdote, there were several Indians who were arrested in Qatar this year in suspicion of spying for Israel, because Qatar is kind of allied with Iran. So this is also a potential influence that happens. And lastly, India may also look into its relations with other global actors in light of the war. Partially, it's getting closer to the West and the US in recent years because they have a mutual economic rival in the form of China. It might look into how much worthwhile it is to be a US ally. It shares a lot of interest with Israel in caring a lot about its sovereignty and freedom of action. And also worth noting, Iran joined BRICS this year, which is a major trade union that India is part of. So there could be room for more trade relations with Iran in the future as well. Now, any questions in the 3 minutes we have left? Let's take Mohammed.
Thank you,
Ma'am,
ma'am,
you
for choosing me. Ma'am, my question was, do you think Iran and Israel war will convert into a world war, and Iran or Israel will start using nuclear weapons?
I think it's not likely. I sadly think it's not impossible. I think nuclear weapons are much less likely than a world war. That would require much further escalation. I can see a situation where this develop into a bigger conflict than what is right now. Neither side wants it. Both Iran and Israel really want to de-escalate. But if further escalations, which are not fully in their control, happen, such as Hezbollah escalates further, which forces Iran to intervene more, and so on, it could grow bigger than this. There's also one more wild card to keep in mind. The American elections are coming soon, and Trump might win. And we have no idea what Trump might do. He's been flirting with nukes for a long time. He has a lot of very extreme takes on a lot of international affairs. He could intervene much less or much more. It is not fully predictable to us, but this could also change the landscape a bit. I'll take one last question. So I think Niyati didn't ask anything yet.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you. So I have two questions. First, how has the assassination of leaders of Iran been, how has it affected like both Iran and Israel? And my second question is that, yes, this would be just one question, that how has assassination of different leaders been impactful or not been impactful for both the countries?
So look, I think most of the Revolutionary Guard members are not that important either to Israel or to Iran. Specifically, the general of the Quds forces was quite significant. To Israel, it is significant because this is the main channel of communication between Iran and Hezbollah. And by taking him down, we hurt Hezbollah for a while. For Iran, it was significant because he was very senior and very close to the Ayatollahs. And this also sparks a precedence where probably they were pressured from other people within the Revolutionary Guard that they could be next, and there has to be some response. So I think it mostly just escalated a lot and potentially caused short-term harm to Hezbollah's capacity. Okay, I have to go. If you want, you can feel free to send me more questions through Kamal if you have some email for that or form.